Hey guys, so here's our ninth lesson on Earth and climate. We're going to be focusing on Canada's emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, there's no note for this lesson. The purpose of this is really just to kind of give you guys some ideas of what's happening in Canada. So this stuff isn't testable or on your exam because it's just a lot of kind of facts and figures, and I don't really want you guys wasting your time just memorizing numbers and such. So it's not testable material. As such, you don't really have to write anything down for this lesson. If you choose to skip it, I could see that some of you will probably do that, and that's fine. If you're choosing to do Canada or focus on Canada for your project, then this might be of value to you. If you're not, then you can probably just skip this one and move on to your next lesson. So we want to take a look at Canada's record. So how do we stack up against the rest of the world, right? Because it's not very meaningful just to take a look at what we're doing, but we want to look at how it compares to what everybody else is doing. And if you take a look at this graph, on the outset, it looks relatively positive, right? You look at Canada when you're at the bottom of the list on this graph. That should be a good thing. And for those of you who are having trouble reading this graph, essentially what we're showing here is, if you can see my mouse, every country seems to have 7 bars. We're looking at data from 1990, 2000, 2005, 2010, and 2012, which is the most recent data before this study was published, or the most recent data they had access to. These next 2 bars, so if we look at this dark blue and this green here, that's projected data. That's data that's projected, that was independently projected by each country. These were submissions, intended nationally determined contributions that were submitted to the United Nations. So it's up to the countries to kind of hold themselves to the standard. Whether they do or don't, we will see, I guess, by 2020 and 2030. So this graph looks good right now. This graph here is just in an inset version of this one because there's such a gap between these top 3 countries and the rest of the world, basically. But let's not get too excited because if we take a look at a different graph that's showing us similar information, Canada is actually closer to the top. Now, this graph is showing us per capita emissions. So what that means is the total greenhouse gas emissions relative to the number of people living in that country. So Canada is a relatively big country in terms of surface area. However, we have only 35 million people. Now, you take that relative to the United States, which has about 10 times that much, and then you look at China and India, which are closer to 1 billion, you can see why what we're doing in Canada might not be the best in terms of per capita numbers. Canada produces a lot of greenhouse gases relative to the number of people that live here. And if you look closely at this graph, you can see that in 2012, our emissions are actually higher per capita than the United States. Now, let's flip over and take a look at what's happening inside Canada. So we're going to take a look at the same 2 kind of ideas, but per province. They've grouped all the territories together. It's not surprising that we don't get much greenhouse gas emissions from the territories. There quite frankly just is not a whole lot going on up there that would produce greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases are produced a lot through industry, manufacturing, cars, driving of cars, which does not happen as much up in the territories. So if we look at the total greenhouse gas emissions per province, we can see that Alberta is right up at the top there. The oil sands are in Alberta, which is unsurprising as to why their greenhouse gas emissions would be so high. Now, these the bars in the graph are showing us the same stuff that they did in the previous one. The metrics on the y-axis are just a little bit different. I believe the previous one was megatons of CO2, where you're talking about kilotons. And again, each of the provinces has set their own respective targets for 2020 and 2030. So we won't really know how we're doing until we hit 2020 and 2030 and we're able to compare ourselves to those targets. If we look at Ontario, we're not too bad. Actually, it'll make more sense when we flip to the next slide. Here, and we'll see that Alberta and Saskatchewan are the highest per capita. So then again, we're looking at the population there relative to the number of greenhouse gas emissions. Ontario is actually pretty low, which is a good thing. There's a big population here in Ontario, And per capita, per person, we don't produce that much CO2. It is still very high, of course, but relative to the rest of the country, it's not too bad. The territories is a little bit overinflated here because there aren't a whole lot of people that live there. Within Canada, it is important to note, though, that Alberta has the highest total emissions, like we saw in the previous slide. It's about 270 megatons. If you look at Saskatchewan, its highest per capita for 2012 at about 67 tons per megatons per capita. So megatons. It's important to take these numbers into context, right? You want to compare it to the number of people living in the province, the size of the province. So the raw numbers, even in themselves, don't give you the entire story. So where are these greenhouse gases coming from? Energy production is the biggest one by far. Generating electrical and heat energy through fossil fuels is the absolute worst thing we can do for the environment. The focus on renewable energy is big. It's renewable and kind of clean energy is where we should be focusing. That will ideally drive down our CO2 emissions. Transportation, both in the sense of using gasoline and then the exhaust produced by cars is a big one. That produces a lot of CO2. Hybrid cars, fully electric cars, such as Tesla motors, are a huge contributor to reducing greenhouse gases. The flip side of using electric cars is obviously you have to charge them somehow, and that energy comes off our grid, which is powered sometimes by fossil fuels. But the energy used to charge a car is much less than the greenhouse gas emissions produced by filling up your car with gasoline and also driving your car, which produces exhaust of CO and CO2 and other things. Agriculture, industrial processes, waste management, these are all other ways in Canada that we produce greenhouse gases. Land use and forestry we'll talk a little bit about on the next slide. And there it is. So you would think the fact that Canada has a whole lot of forest land, we have approximately 30% of the entire world's boreal forests. Especially if you're up on the west coast, there's a whole lot of trees there. A lot of big, beautiful forests. And originally, based on a couple lessons ago, you think, well, that's great, right? Forests are carbon sinks. So the more forests we have, the more carbon we'll be able to pull, or CO2 we'll be able to pull out of the atmosphere. And initially, you're right, but there's a problem here. They only act as carbon sinks when they're healthy. They can be a large source of carbon if and when they get damaged, whether by insects, wildfires, or deforestation. There have been some stories, if you just take a look at the news on CBC, there are some stories where there were wildfires out on the west coast. And all of these processes, whether insect invasion or wildfires or deforestation, these processes damage the trees and kill the trees, which speed up decomposition and increase CO2 emissions. Trees, along with people and all mammals, we're all carbon-based life forms. So when we die and decompose, there's a whole lot of carbon that's released. Whenever we cut down a tree, there's a lot of CO2 that gets released into the atmosphere. So you can take a look at that graph there on the right, and it's showing you different periods in time where trees were acting as carbon sinks versus carbon sources. Now we're lucky that you can see most of the dots on that scatter graph are in the bottom, meaning that they've been removing carbon from the atmosphere, but there are some up at the top, particularly around 1995, which should be a cause for concern. So lastly, we want to look at what's Canada going to do. Well, very recently we signed on to the Paris Agreement. Almost every country involved signed on to the Paris Agreement. Canada's pledge was to cut greenhouse gas emissions to 30% below what we had in 2005 by 2030. This is very ambitious. The problem with Canada and other Western democracies is that governments change fairly often. So this was obviously signed by the current Liberal government. If in 3 years from now they're not in power, this may not be the pledge anymore. The previous government was not a huge fan of the Kyoto Accord, and that did not last very long before it was very clear that Canada was not going to meet our Kyoto targets. Another thing that Canada is trying to do is they're trying to cap Alberta to 100 megatons of CO2 emissions. We're looking to reduce methane. This was an agreement or kind of a commitment jointly agreed to by the United States. Now, again, there was a change in power in the United States very recently, or there will be, I guess, in just a few days. So it's unsure whether or not the United States will continue to honor that commitment. We're looking to phase out coal-fired electricity. This idea is projected to net 15 million tons of reductions. So again, the biggest problem with all these promises is that in 3 years from now, when the next election rolls around, if a different government is in power, there's no real consequence to them not holding these promises. In the last election, the current Liberal government had a big focus on the environment, right? Justin Trudeau very famously said, "If you can't have a strong economy without a healthy environment," and he has all these pledges and all these ideas are under his government. Now, if that changes in the next few years, we can only wait and see. It's up to the current government to really follow through with their promises, and then come the next election, they can use that as a good point. If they don't follow through with their promises, it's something that can very easily be jumped on by the opposition, and these things usually lead to changes in power. So I hope you learned something in this lesson. There's only a couple more to go, and then we'll be done our climate unit. So as always, let me know if you have any questions in class, and good luck on your projects.